The dog wouldn't leave the fireplace, no matter how many times the old man pulled him away. The floorboard cracked under Harold's weight as Atlas lunged back toward the stone hearth, claws scraping against wood like he'd caught a scent that didn't belong. Outside, tires rolled slowly across gravel. Harold froze, hand hovering over the pry bar, heart steady but alert. Atlas didn't bark. He just stared at the same spot, unmoving. And then something beneath the cabin answered back with a hollow knock. The house looked smaller without the furniture. Harold Bennett stood on the cracked concrete walkway, just a step below the front porch, his weight balanced evenly across both feet, as if he were still waiting for someone to give him a direction. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the yard, catching on the empty windows like hollow eyes. The curtains were gone. The framed photos were gone. Even the wind chime that used to hang by the door had disappeared, leaving only a faint metal hook swaying in the breeze. 2 worn suitcases sat by the curb. They were old, the kind with scuffed corners and zippers that no longer moved smoothly. One leaned slightly to the side, as if it couldn't quite carry the weight of what had been forced into it. The other was upright, rigid, like it was trying to hold its shape a little longer. Harold didn't look at them right away. His gaze remained fixed on the sedan at the end of the driveway. The engine was already running, smooth, quiet, expensive. Linda Bennett stood beside the open passenger door, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her posture composed in that same careful way she had carried herself for years. Her coat was pressed, her hair pinned just enough to stay in place against the wind. Nothing about her suggested hesitation. Harold noticed the small things. He always did. The way her fingers tapped once against the door. Not nervous, just impatient. The way she avoided looking directly at him. The way the driver, some young man Harold didn't recognize, kept his hands on the wheel, eyes forward, like he had been instructed not to engage. Details, always details. Harold shifted slightly, his right hand hanging close to his side, fingers loose but ready. It was an old habit. He didn't think about it anymore. His body simply settled into it. Linda finally spoke. "You have everything you need." Her voice didn't carry far. It didn't need to. Just the space between them felt smaller than it was, compressed by something neither of them chose to say. Harold didn't answer. A gust of wind moved across the yard, dragging dry leaves along the edge of the pavement. One of them caught briefly against the toe of his boot before spinning away. Linda's eyes flickered, not toward him, but toward the suitcases. "That's what the court awarded," she added, her tone steady. "It's all been handled." Handled. The word hung there. Harold's jaw shifted slightly, not tightening, just adjusting like he was about to say something, and then decided against it. From inside the car, a faint electronic chime sounded, some system alerting that the door had been open too long. Linda exhaled, barely noticeable. "You'll be fine, Harold." There was no emphasis in her voice. No edge. No softness either. Oh, just a statement delivered like it had already been rehearsed enough times to lose its meaning. For a brief second, Harold's eyes moved past her, toward the empty hallway visible through the open front door. The wall where their wedding photo had hung was bare now. A lighter rectangle marked where it had been, untouched by years of dust and sunlight. 48 years, reduced to a clean patch of paint. The car door slammed shut. The sound cracked through the still air sharper than it should have. Harold flinched. It wasn't obvious to anyone who didn't know what to look for. His shoulders didn't jerk. He didn't step back. But something inside him tightened instantly, a reflex buried deep in muscle memory. His head turned slightly, scanning, not the car, but the perimeter. Left, right, tree line, driveway edge. For half a second, he wasn't standing in a quiet neighborhood. He was somewhere else. Dust. Heat. A metal door slamming too hard. Contact possible. Then it was gone. The engine revved gently, the sedan rolling forward with controlled precision. No sudden movement. No gravel thrown. Just a clean exit. Harold's gaze followed it, steady, unblinking. Atlas didn't move. The German shepherd stood pressed against Harold's left leg, his body angled slightly forward, ears erect, eyes locked on the departing vehicle. There was no barking, no growling, just a focused stillness, like he was memorizing something. The car turned at the end of the street and disappeared. Silence settled in behind it. Not immediate. It crept back in slowly, filling the space the engine had left behind, stretching across the yard, the empty house, the street with no one watching. Harold remained where he was. He didn't step toward the suitcases. He didn't turn back to the house. His breathing stayed even, controlled. In, out. No change in rhythm. Atlas shifted first. Just a small movement, his head tilting slightly upward, his gaze lifting from the road to Harold's face. The dog waited, not for a command, just waiting. Harold blinked once, then his right hand moved, slow and deliberate, slipping into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers brushed against something cold, metal, small, familiar. He pulled it out, a brass key, worn smooth along the edges, the surface dulled by time and use. It wasn't ornate, no markings that stood out at first glance, but it had weight. Real weight. The kind that didn't come from size. Harold held it between his thumb and forefinger, turning it slightly so the fading light caught along its ridges. For a moment, his eyes lost focus. Not drifting, but looking through it, past it, somewhere deeper. A porch, wooden steps, the smell of pine in the air, a voice calling from somewhere inside a cabin, soft but clear. He closed his hand around the key. Atlas let out a quiet breath, settling back on his haunches but not taking his eyes off Harold. The old man finally looked down at the suitcases. 2 pieces. That was it. He stepped forward. The movement measured, almost mechanical at first. He reached for the upright one, testing its weight before lifting it fully. The handle creaked slightly under the strain. The second suitcase came next. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate either, just moved. Atlas walked beside him as Harold crossed the yard, not toward the front door, but past it. The house stayed behind him, the open doorway, the empty rooms, all of it. At the edge of the driveway sat a truck that had seen better decades. Faded paint, a small dent along the rear panel. The kind of vehicle that didn't draw attention because it had long since stopped trying. Harold set the suitcases in the back. One, then the other. He paused there for a moment, one hand resting on the metal edge of the truck bed. The air felt colder now, or maybe it just wasn't blocked by walls anymore. Atlas jumped up into the back without being told, circling once before settling near the suitcases. He didn't lie down, just sat, watching. Harold closed the tailgate. The sound echoed softly. He walked around to the driver's side and opened the door and climbed in. The seat groaned under his weight. For a moment, he didn't start the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers spread slightly, feeling the worn texture beneath them. Outside, the street remained empty. No neighbors, no movement, nothing left to hold him there. Harold reached into his pocket again, feeling the outline of the key without taking it out this time. Then he turned the ignition. The engine coughed once before settling into a low, steady rumble. Atlas shifted in the back, adjusting his stance as the truck came to life. Harold checked the mirrors. Left, right, rear, old habits. He pulled away from the curb without looking back. The house shrank in the mirror, then disappeared entirely. The road stretched ahead, quiet, uncertain, open. Harold didn't speak. Atlas didn't move, and somewhere in the space between them, the weight of everything that had been taken and everything that had not began to settle into something else, something not yet clear, something not yet finished. The truck rolled for nearly an hour before Harold pulled off the road. It wasn't a planned stop. Not really. Just a stretch of gravel beside an old gas station that had long since stopped selling anything but dust and faded promises. The overhead sign still hung crooked above the pumps, its letters half peeled away by years of sun and wind. Harold eased the truck into the shadow of the building, cutting the engine before the tires had fully settled. Silence rushed in again. Different this time. Closer. Atlas shifted in the back, his nails tapping once against the metal before going still. As Harold didn't move right away, his hands stayed on the wheel, fingers resting where they had been for miles. The ticking sound of the engine cooling filled the cab, sharp, uneven clicks that echoed just a little too loud in the enclosed space. He listened. Not to the truck, to everything else. Wind across open ground. A loose sheet of tin somewhere behind the building, knocking softly against wood. Distant highway noise, faint enough to ignore, close enough to track. No footsteps. No voices. No engines slowing nearby. He exhaled slowly, then reached for the door handle. The air outside carried a bite to it, colder than before, the kind that slipped through layers without asking. Harold walked around the truck, checking the perimeter without making it obvious, eyes moving, not his head. Old habit. Always check the angles. Well, the front of the building was open enough. No cover worth noting. The back, narrow alley, blocked partially by stacked crates and a rusted dumpster. One entrance, two exits, limited visibility from the road. Not ideal, but it would do. Atlas jumped down quietly, landing beside him without a sound. The dog stretched once, then stood still, nose lifted slightly, testing the air. Harold watched him for a second. Atlas wasn't restless, just alert. Harold nodded faintly, more to himself than anything. "Yeah," he murmured under his breath. "We'll stay light." He opened the truck bed, pulled out one of the suitcases, then thought better of it and closed it again. No need. Not tonight. Inside the cab, the seat leaned back just far enough to take the edge off. Harold adjusted it once, then stopped, leaving it where it landed. And he didn't remove his boots, didn't loosen his jacket, just sat. Atlas circled once on the passenger side floor, then lowered himself carefully, body angled toward the door, always toward the door. Harold noticed that. Another small thing, another detail. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a small flashlight, checked the battery with a quick click, then set it within reach. The sky outside darkened gradually, not all at once. The last of the daylight clung to the horizon before finally giving way, leaving the world in muted shades of gray and black. Harold closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest them. The first sound came about 20 minutes later. Metal, light, irregular. A soft clink like something shifting just enough to make contact, then stopping. Harold's eyes opened instantly. No hesitation. Well, his breathing didn't change, but everything else did. His right hand moved, slow and controlled, toward the flashlight. He didn't turn it on. Not yet. Atlas was already up. No bark, no growl. Just standing, muscles tight, ears forward, eyes locked on the passenger side window. Harold followed the dog's line of sight. Nothing visible, just darkness. Another sound, this time from farther out. A vehicle. Engine low, steady, not accelerating, just moving. Harold leaned slightly, enough to catch the reflection in the side mirror. Headlights, dimmed, moving slow along the road they had just left. Too slow. The vehicle didn't pass immediately. It lingered, crawling forward as if searching for something without wanting to be seen doing it. Harold stayed still, counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. The headlights drifted past the edge of the building, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground before continuing down the road. No sudden movement. No stop. But not normal either. Atlas remained standing. Harold waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Only when the sound of the engine had completely faded did he reach for the flashlight. A quick beam across the cab. Clear. Another sweep toward the ground outside. No immediate movement. He opened the door slowly, stepping out without letting it slam. The night air hit colder now. Harold moved along the side of the truck, boots finding the ground without noise. He crouched slightly near the front tire, scanning the dirt. Tracks. Fresh. Not from his truck. Different tread. Wider. He followed them with his eyes as far as the darkness allowed, on noting direction, depth, spacing. Recent. Very recent. Atlas moved closer, lowering his head to the ground, sniffing once, then pulling back slightly. Not confused, but cautious. Harold straightened. His gaze shifted back to the road. Empty, but not clean. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. He stepped back into the truck, closing the door quietly behind him. Atlas climbed in after him, settling again, but this time his body didn't fully relax. Neither did Harold. He leaned his head back against the seat. The darkness inside the cab felt heavier now, more crowded. Sleep came eventually, not because he wanted it, because his body forced it. And when it didn't come quietly. The first flash was light, white, blinding, sudden. Then heat, then the sound, deep, concussive, ripping through everything at once. Harold jerked awake, breath cutting short, his body already halfway turned, hand reaching. Nothing. No explosion. No dust. Just the cab of the truck. Dark. Silent. Atlas's head was already lifted, watching him. Harold sat there, unmoving, his chest rising and falling just a fraction faster than before. He didn't wipe the sweat from his temple, didn't close his eyes again, just stared forward, letting the present settle back into place over the past. Minutes passed, maybe more. Eventually, he reached into his pocket. The key. Still there. Cold. Solid. Real. He held it for a moment, thumb brushing over its worn edge, then let it go. Morning came slowly, gray light creeping over the horizon, pushing the night back inch by inch. Harold stepped out of the truck, stretching once, well, not fully, just enough to reset his balance. Atlas jumped down beside him, shaking out his coat before scanning the area again. No new tracks, no vehicles, nothing out of place. But the feeling didn't leave. Harold walked to the front of the truck, rested his hand on the hood for a second, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. He looked out toward the road, then beyond it, toward somewhere else entirely. The key weighed heavier in his pocket now. Not physically. Just there. Waiting. He turned back to the truck, opened the driver's door, and climbed in. Atlas followed. This time, when Harold started the engine, he didn't hesitate. He pulled onto the road, heading west, toward the mountains, toward the cabin, toward whatever had been left behind, and whatever had already started looking for it. From the highway thinned the farther west they drove. Concrete gave way to cracked asphalt. Billboards disappeared. Gas stations became fewer, spaced out like forgotten markers on an old map. Harold kept the speed steady, never too fast, never drifting. Atlas stood in the back seat now, front paws braced on the center console, watching the road ahead through the windshield. He didn't pant, didn't whine, just watched. By midday, the mountains began to rise in the distance, blue and uneven against a wide Idaho sky. Snow clung to the higher ridges, even this late in the season. The closer they got, the quieter the world seemed to become. Cell service bars dropped one by one until the screen on the dash read, "No signal." Harold noticed. He didn't comment. Instead, he checked the rearview mirror again. Nothing unusual. But he didn't stop checking. They left the main highway just after noon, turning onto a narrower road that wound along the edge of a valley. Pine trees thickened on both sides. The air changed, cooler, cleaner, sharper. Harold rolled down the window halfway. The scent of resin and damp earth drifted in. Atlas lifted his nose, testing it. Harold's fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel, not impatient, calculating. He recognized terrain patterns the way some men recognized faces, where the road dipped low near water, where the tree line thinned, where an approach would be visible from above. The cabin wasn't far now. He hadn't been back in over 20 years, but he didn't need GPS, Some coordinates never leave. The paved road ended without warning, replaced by compacted dirt and loose gravel. The truck jolted slightly as it adjusted to the uneven surface. Harold reduced speed, eyes scanning both sides of the tree line automatically. Two-track trail ahead. Limited turnaround. He drove past it once, just to be sure. He continued another quarter-mile before easing onto a small clearing and turning the truck around slowly. No sudden steering, no dust plume larger than necessary. Then he approached the trail again, this time slower. Atlas shifted. His posture changed first. He lowered himself slightly, weight forward, ears rising higher than before. His eyes tracked something Harold couldn't see yet. Harold noticed immediately. "What is it?" he muttered quietly. The dog didn't bark, but he didn't relax either. Harold let the truck roll forward into the trail. Branches brushed against the sides, scraping faint lines along old paint. The forest closed in quickly, the canopy overhead narrowing the light into long, thin shafts that cut through the dimness. The trail curved once, then twice. Harold counted the turns automatically. First bend, blind right. Second bend, higher elevation. Third. The trees opened. And there it was. The cabin stood in a small clearing, tilted slightly to one side as if it had grown tired of holding itself upright. The roof sagged near the back corner. The porch rail leaned unevenly. Moss clung to the lower boards like a quiet claim of ownership. But it was still standing. Harold eased off the gas and let the truck roll the final few feet before stopping completely. He didn't get out immediately. He studied it first. Windows intact, door closed, no visible smoke, no obvious disturbance from this distance. Atlas remained upright, eyes locked on the structure. Then he did something unusual. He didn't wait for a command. He jumped down from the truck before Harold had fully cut the engine. He landed softly and moved forward 3 steps, then stopped. Not running, not charging, just standing there, body rigid, staring at the cabin. Harold stepped out slowly. He closed the truck door without slamming it. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the faint creak of old wood somewhere in the distance. Atlas didn't move, his gaze fixed on the stone chimney along the side of the cabin. Harold followed the line of sight. Nothing obvious. But the dog wasn't wrong often. Harold walked forward, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth of the clearing, and he kept his shoulders relaxed, arms loose at his sides. But his eyes were sharp. He circled once, wide arc, not approaching the front door immediately. Checking corners, checking the rear wall, checking the ground. Near the side of the porch, he paused. Tracks. Faint. Not animal. Boot tread. Recent enough to be defined. Not fresh enough to shine. Someone had been here. Atlas moved closer to Harold's left side, his body pressing lightly against his leg. Harold crouched slowly, examining the imprint without touching it. Size roughly 11. Deep enough to suggest weight. Direction. Toward the porch. Not away. He stood. The wind shifted slightly then, stirring leaves across the clearing. The cabin boards responded with a long, thin creak that carried across the open space. Harold's jaw set just slightly. He stepped onto the porch. The first board groaned under his weight. He paused, listening. No movement inside. He reached for the door handle. Cold. He tested it gently. Locked. He removed the brass key from his pocket, the same one he had held in the driveway. He inserted it slowly. It resisted at first. He adjusted angle, applied slight pressure. The lock clicked. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet. Harold opened the door. The air inside was stale but not rotten. Dust hung in thin layers across the furniture. The old stone fireplace stood exactly where he remembered. The wooden table remained centered in the room, covered in a faded cloth that had yellowed with time. Nothing overturned, nothing broken, but something felt off. Atlas stepped in behind him, Immediately, the dog stopped, though his ears flattened slightly. He turned his head toward the far wall. Harold closed the door halfway behind them, allowing only a sliver of light to spill across the floor. He stood still, letting his eyes adjust. Then he noticed it. One patch of floor near the fireplace looked cleaner than the rest. Not polished, just less dusty, as if something had disturbed it recently. Harold didn't move toward it yet. Instead, he walked slowly along the wall, fingers brushing lightly against wood surfaces. No heavy dust displaced near the shelves, no obvious drag marks. But the absence of dust near that one section remained. Atlas took one step closer to it, then another. He didn't scratch, didn't bark, just stood over it. Harold glanced at the ceiling. No water damage near that area. He looked at the nails in the floorboards, and one of them looked newer, just slightly shinier. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for him. He straightened. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath. Atlas lowered himself into a sit beside the spot, eyes never leaving it. Harold didn't speak. He stepped back toward the door and looked out into the clearing again. Nothing moved. But the feeling from the night before returned. Someone had passed through this place, maybe recently. Maybe more than once. Harold closed the door fully this time. The latch clicked. He turned the lock. Atlas shifted closer to him, body angled toward the fireplace. Harold removed his jacket slowly and draped it over the back of a chair without breaking eye contact with the section of floor. Then he moved toward the fireplace. He knelt down near the edge of the stone and placed his palm flat on the wood. Still, listening, waiting. The cabin did not answer, but the silence felt thinner now, like something beneath it was waiting to be uncovered. Harold kept his hand on the floorboard a few seconds longer. The wood felt solid, old, dry, but not untouched. Atlas shifted beside him, letting out a slow breath through his nose. The dog's ears remained angled forward, focused on that same narrow strip near the stone fireplace. Harold finally stood. He didn't reach for a tool, didn't pry. Not yet. Instead, he stepped away from the spot and began moving through the rest of the cabin with quiet patience. If something was hidden, it wouldn't be the only sign. He cleared the room the way he had cleared buildings long ago, methodical, slow, but never crossing in front of a doorway without checking the corners first. His boots barely made a sound against the wood. His shoulders stayed relaxed, but his eyes never stopped moving. Kitchen first. The old porcelain sink was dry, coated in dust. Cabinet doors hung slightly crooked. He opened each one without rushing. Plates stacked where his mother had left them. A jar of salt hardened into a white block. No fresh disturbance inside. He moved to the back hallway. The narrow passage creaked faintly with every step. Atlas followed close, brushing lightly against Harold's leg whenever the boards groaned too sharply, as if anchoring him back to the present. At the bedroom door, Harold paused. The hinge gave a long, tired squeal when he pushed it open. The bed still stood against the far wall, quilt folded at the foot. A thin layer of dust coated the wooden dresser. Sunlight leaked through a crack in the curtain, cutting a pale stripe across the floor. Harold stood still there longer than he had in the main room. The smell of pine lingered faintly beneath the dust. For a moment, the cabin felt warmer in his mind than it did in reality. A kettle on the stove, a radio playing softly, his mother humming somewhere near the window. The memory flickered and was gone. He scanned the floor. No footprints here. No disturbed boards. Nothing recent. Atlas moved past him and circled once in the room, then returned to the hallway without interest. That meant something. Harold stepped back into the main room. The fireplace drew his eyes again. The stonework looked the same. The mantel still held the old iron clock that hadn't ticked in years. A stack of firewood leaned neatly against the wall, dry, untouched. He crouched beside it. One log had been shifted, only slightly, but enough. He reached out and adjusted it back into place. Beneath the woodpile, the dust was thinner. Not gone, just disturbed. Atlas rose from where he had been sitting and stepped closer, lowering his nose toward the edge of the hearth. Harold picked up the poker resting beside the fireplace. He tapped the stone gently. Solid. Then he tapped the floorboard again. A different sound. Not hollow enough to confirm anything, but not solid either. He froze. A sound from outside. Not wind. Not branches. Something brushing against metal. Harold stood instantly, moving toward the window beside the door without stepping directly into the center of it. He shifted to the side, now letting only one eye peer past the edge of the curtain. The clearing looked empty. The truck sat where he had left it. No movement near the tree line. He listened again. There. A faint scrape. From the direction of the back shed. Atlas was already at the door, body rigid, tail low but steady. Harold didn't open it immediately. He waited. Counted his breath. Then he unlocked the latch slowly and pulled the door inward just enough to step through. The air outside felt heavier now. The trees stood still, their tops barely moving. He moved along the side of the cabin, keeping his back close to the wall. The shed came into view, a small wooden structure half hidden behind brush. The door hung slightly ajar. Harold hadn't checked it earlier. That was on him. He approached carefully, his boots finding the quieter patches of ground between loose gravel and dry leaves. Atlas followed, but stayed a step behind this time, waiting for direction. Harold reached the shed door and nudged it open with the edge of his boot. The hinges protested. Inside, the space was cramped. Old tools leaned against the wall. Hoe, shovel, rake. A rusted lantern sat on a shelf. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams. But near the center of the dirt floor, the soil had been disturbed. Not dug deep, just shifted. Like someone had tested it and then stopped. Harold crouched again, pressing his fingers lightly into the loose dirt. Still slightly damp beneath the top layer. Recent. Not hours. Maybe days. Atlas stepped forward this time and sniffed the ground carefully. He let out a low sound in his throat. Not a growl, but a warning that something unfamiliar had passed through here. Harold stood slowly. His eyes moved back toward the cabin. The feeling settled in heavier now. This place hadn't just been visited. It had been examined. He returned to the main clearing, scanning the tree line once more. No movement. But the quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt watched. Harold went back inside and shut the door firmly behind him. He turned the lock. Then he moved a heavy chair slightly closer to the door, not blocking it, just adjusting it enough to notice if it shifted. Atlas resumed his position near the fireplace, but he didn't sit this time. He remained standing. Harold stepped back to the section of floor near the stone hearth. He looked down at it with new clarity. If someone had been here, they hadn't taken anything. They hadn't trashed the place. They had searched, and either found nothing or decided to come back. He crouched again and ran his fingers along the seam between two boards. There, a faint indentation near the nail head. The wood around it was just slightly newer, replaced at some point. Atlas shifted closer. Harold placed his palm flat against the floor once more. This time he knocked twice with his knuckles. The sound came back to him differently than before. Not open, but not solid. A muted echo beneath. He didn't pry. Not tonight. He stood. The sky outside had begun to dim again, the light fading into a deep blue through the windows. Harold moved toward the fireplace and began stacking wood inside it. He struck a match from an old box he found in the kitchen drawer. The flame caught slowly at first, kind of licking along the dry kindling before growing steady. The fire filled the room with a faint orange glow. Shadows shifted across the walls. Atlas finally lowered himself onto the floor, but his head remained up. Harold sat in the chair opposite the hearth, elbows resting lightly on his knees. He didn't close his eyes, didn't relax fully. The crackle of the fire brought back a memory he didn't ask for. Another night, another structure. Heat rising too quickly, radio chatter cutting through static. He blinked once. The cabin returned. Wood walls, stone hearth. Atlas breathing steady beside him. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key again. He held it up in the firelight. It glowed faintly, worn edges catching the flicker. His mother had pressed it into his hand years ago without much explanation. "Oh, keep this," she had said, "just in case." He hadn't asked what case. Now he wondered. The floorboard near the fireplace creaked softly on its own as the temperature shifted. Harold's eyes snapped to it instantly. Atlas's head lifted at the same time. They both watched the same spot. The cabin didn't move again, but the message was clear. This place wasn't done revealing itself, and neither was whoever had come looking for it. Morning came thin and pale through the cabin windows. Harold was already awake. He hadn't truly slept, not the kind of sleep that lets a man drift. Every shift of wood, every whisper of wind through the boards had settled into him like distant radio static. Atlas had not left his spot near the fireplace. When Harold rose from the chair, the dog stood immediately, stretching once before stepping back toward the same section of floor. No hesitation, no confusion, just certainty. Harold moved toward the kitchen first. He filled a dented kettle with water from the hand pump outside, then returned to the stove. The flame caught after a few tries. He didn't rush it. Routine mattered. He poured the hot water into an old enamel mug and stood by the window while the steam rose slowly into the cool air. The clearing looked unchanged in daylight. Truck still there. Tree line steady. But Harold didn't let the calm fool him. He drank half the coffee before setting the mug down and kneeling again beside the fireplace. Atlas watched. Harold pressed both palms against the floorboards this time, feeling for variation in grain, temperature, pressure. He shifted slightly, leaning his weight forward. Then he knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. The second knock returned a duller sound than the rest. He stayed there, listening. The echo beneath wasn't wide, not a large cavity, but it wasn't solid earth either. Atlas moved closer, lowering his nose to the seam between 2 boards. He scratched once, lightly, not frantic, just precise. There. Harold stood and walked to the shed. He returned with a flat pry bar and a hammer worn smooth along the grip. He paused before starting, listened again. Nothing outside. No engines. No movement. He slid the pry bar carefully beneath the edge of the newer board near the shinier nail head. Applied pressure. The wood resisted at first, then lifted with a long, dry crack that echoed through the room. Atlas flinched at the sound but didn't retreat. Harold worked slowly, loosening each nail rather than ripping it free. He set the boards aside in the same order he removed them. Underneath, packed dirt, but not undisturbed. The soil was slightly darker, recently turned. Harold leaned closer. Atlas stepped forward and scratched again, harder this time. Harold dug with his hands at first, brushing aside the top layer of soil. The dirt was compacted, but not old hard. It gave way easier than it should have after decades. A foot down, the shovel made contact with something. Not stone. Metal. Harold froze. Atlas let out a sharp breath, stepping back just enough to give space. Harold cleared more dirt around the edge. A concrete slab, square, roughly 2 feet by 2 feet, embedded flush beneath the floor. He brushed away the remaining soil along its edges until a narrow lip became visible, as a small recessed handle lay centered near one corner. Harold exhaled slowly through his nose. Someone had known about this, and someone had tried to find it. He wiped his hands against his jeans and gripped the handle. Before he pulled, Atlas's ears snapped toward the front of the cabin. A vehicle. Distant at first, then closer. Gravel crunching under tires. Harold released the handle instantly and replaced the loosened boards over the opening without hammering them down fully. He scattered dirt across the surface quickly, smoothing it with the flat of the shovel. The engine outside grew louder. Atlas moved toward the door, body stiff, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Harold stood and wiped his hands again, then stepped toward the front window without fully exposing himself. A pickup truck rolled into the clearing, newer than his. Black. Polished. It stopped about 15 feet from the porch. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Mid-40s, broad shoulders, boots too clean for regular forest work, sunglasses pushed up onto his head. His movements weren't hurried, confident. He scanned the clearing once before walking toward the cabin. Harold opened the door before the man could knock. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him just enough to block the interior view. Atlas stood at his side, silent. The man stopped a few feet from the steps and gave a thin smile. "Morning," he said easily. "Didn't expect anyone to be up here?" Harold didn't return the smile. "You are." The man glanced at the truck parked behind Harold, then back at the cabin. "Name's Derek Cole," he said. He was extending a hand halfway before letting it fall when Harold didn't move. "I manage some land interests around this area." Harold remained still. Derek's eyes flicked once toward Atlas. "That your dog?" Harold nodded once. "He's well trained," Derek added. "Hasn't barked once." Atlas didn't move, didn't blink. Derek shifted his weight, gaze drifting toward the side of the cabin, then toward the tree line. "You planning to stay?" he asked casually. "For now." Derek smiled again, though it didn't reach his eyes. "This land's been sitting unused for a long time. A lot of folks assumed it was abandoned. It isn't." Derek's gaze lingered just slightly longer on the porch boards. "Right," he said softly. "Of course." Silence settled between them. Derek took one slow step backward. "Well, if you're ever interested in selling, and I'd be happy to talk numbers. Cash deal. Quick." Harold tilted his head just slightly. "How long have you been coming up here?" Derek's smile tightened. "Oh, I pass through now and then, just keeping track of properties in the region." Atlas took one deliberate step forward, positioning himself directly between Derek and the porch steps. Derek noticed. He held Harold's gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded. "I'll leave you to it." He turned and walked back to his truck. The engine started. Gravel shifted. The truck backed slowly before turning around and disappearing down the trail. Harold remained on the porch until the sound had fully faded. Only then did he step back inside. Atlas followed, ears still high. Harold locked the door and stood still for several seconds. Then he walked back to the fireplace. And he knelt again, removed the boards, cleared the dirt. The concrete slab waited beneath. He gripped the recessed handle once more. This time there was no interruption. He pulled. The slab lifted with more resistance than he expected, scraping lightly against the surrounding earth before rising enough to reveal darkness beneath. A hollow space. Atlas leaned forward. Harold held the slab open with one arm and reached for the flashlight with the other. He clicked it on and aimed the beam downward. The light cut into the void below, revealing the edge of something hidden, something placed there deliberately, and not meant to be found easily. The beam of the flashlight cut deeper into the cavity. Concrete walls, tight, reinforced. Not an old root cellar, not a simple storage pit. Engineered. Yeah, Harold lowered himself onto one knee and angled the light further inside. The space extended about 4 feet down, then leveled out. A small metal box rested against the far wall, edges worn but intact. Before he could study it longer, Atlas's head snapped toward the front door. The dog didn't bark. He didn't move wildly. He froze. Every muscle locked. Harold killed the flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed the room. Then came the sound. Not from outside. From beneath the floor. A faint scrape. Metal against metal. Slow. Deliberate. Harold didn't move. His breathing flattened. Atlas's low growl vibrated in the silence. Barely audible, but steady. Another sound. A soft tug, like someone testing something below. Harold's pulse didn't spike outward. It narrowed inward. Contact. When he eased the slab back into place without letting it drop. Covered it with the boards again. No hammer. No noise. The scrape came again. Closer now. Directly beneath where he had just been kneeling. Atlas stepped back toward the door, positioning himself between Harold and the entrance. Harold didn't turn on the light. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he stepped silently toward the wall and pressed his ear lightly against the wood near the fireplace. The sound below stopped. Silence. Then a faint vibration through the boards. Someone was underneath. Not in the cavity. Deeper. Outside the foundation. Probing. Harold moved to the window beside the door and shifted the curtain barely an inch. Nothing in the clearing. But the ground near the back corner of the cabin looked slightly unsettled. A shadow moved. Fast. Too fast to be wind. Harold stepped back from the window and gestured once to Atlas. The dog moved instantly to the rear wall. Harold reached for the flashlight again, but kept it off. He opened the back window just enough to slip out quietly. The night air was colder than before. Atlas slipped through after him, landing without sound. Harold moved low along the cabin's side, boots finding the darker patches of soil. At the back corner, he crouched. There, a section of earth near the foundation had been disturbed. A thin metal rod protruded from the ground, no thicker than a tent stake. Testing depth, testing structure. Harold gripped it and pulled. The rod came free smoothly. Whoever had inserted it hadn't expected resistance. A branch snapped somewhere beyond the tree line. Atlas turned sharply toward the sound, teeth visible now, a growl finally escaping his chest. Harold's eyes tracked left, then right. He saw it. A figure slipping between the trees, just far enough to blend with shadow. Not running wildly, moving controlled, deliberate. Harold stood. "Stop!" His voice carried low but firm. The figure paused only for a second, then moved again. Harold didn't chase blindly. He advanced 2 steps, scanning for flanking movement. Nothing. The forest swallowed the intruder. Atlas strained forward, wanting pursuit. Harold placed a hand lightly against the dog's shoulder. "Negative," he muttered under his breath. The forest went still again. But it wasn't empty. Harold knew that. He remained outside for several minutes, listening for breath, movement, weight shift. Nothing else revealed itself. Eventually, he stepped back toward the cabin. Atlas didn't relax. Inside, Harold secured the door and pulled one of the heavier chairs fully against it this time. He moved through the room, extinguishing the small lantern he had lit earlier. Total darkness. He sat in the chair near the fireplace. Waited. Minutes stretched. Then an hour. Atlas remained awake beside him, eyes fixed on the door. At some point, the wind rose stronger, rattling the boards and making the cabin shift slightly on its foundation. Harold didn't close his eyes. He watched the darker outline of the door against the faint light of the window. Then, a shadow crossed it. Quick, outside. Harold's muscles tightened, but he stayed seated. A faint tug at the door handle. Slow. Testing. The chair shifted slightly under the pressure. Atlas rose silently, while another tug. Then stillness. Harold spoke without raising his voice. "You don't want to do that." Silence answered. The handle stopped moving. Footsteps retreated from the porch. Slow at first, then faster. Gravel crunched near the edge of the clearing. An engine turned over. Harold counted. 1, 2, 3. The vehicle didn't start fully. It idled, then reversed, then cut off abruptly. Atlas's ears flattened again. Another vehicle, different engine, approaching from the opposite direction. 2 sets of headlights flashed briefly through the window. Voices outside. Low. Arguing. Harold couldn't make out the words. Then one engine roared and sped off down the trail. The other followed moments later. Silence returned. Harold didn't move for several minutes after the last sound faded. Atlas remained standing, when finally Harold rose. He approached the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. The clearing was empty, but tire tracks crossed each other near the edge of the tree line. 2 vehicles. Different tread patterns. Not coordinated. Not allies. Something about that settled deeper than the intrusion itself. Someone had been digging, and someone else had interrupted them. The cabin wasn't just being watched. It was contested. Harold stepped back into the center of the room. He knelt once more near the fireplace, lifted the boards, exposed the slab. He opened it again carefully. Atlas hovered close this time, shoulder brushing Harold's arm. Harold lowered himself partially into the cavity, shining the flashlight across the small metal box at the bottom. The lid was sealed, no dust on its surface. No, meaning it had been disturbed before, but not opened. Harold reached down and gripped the box, heavy. He pulled it upward slowly. As it cleared the edge of the opening, a sudden metallic snap echoed from behind him. Harold twisted instantly. Atlas lunged. A thin wire stretched across the doorway at knee height, tightened from outside. A trap. If the door had opened fully without resistance, it would have triggered something attached. Harold's eyes tracked the line. It ran toward the porch. Atlas barked once, sharp. Harold moved toward the door and eased it open carefully. The wire led to a small metal canister wedged under the porch rail. Improvised. Crude, but capable of causing harm. Not lethal. A warning. Harold knelt and disabled it calmly, cutting the line and removing the device without rushing. Stood guard, eyes scanning the tree line again. Harold returned inside, set the metal box on the table, closed the slab, replaced the boards. Then he sat in the chair opposite the box. The firelight flickered across the metal surface. Atlas lay beside his boots, breathing steady but alert. Harold stared at the box for a long time. Whoever wanted this place was no longer subtle, and whoever else had shown up tonight wasn't finished. The cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a line, and Harold Bennett had no intention of stepping back from it. The metal box sat on the table between him and the firelight. Harold didn't open it. Not yet. He had learned long ago that rushing the objective was how men got hurt. Atlas lay near his boots, eyes half closed but not asleep. Every few seconds, and one ear twitched toward the door, toward the windows, toward whatever might shift beyond the walls. Harold leaned forward in the chair and studied the boards near the fireplace again. The slab had come up too easily, too clean. That cavity hadn't been the end of it. Someone had probed from outside the foundation. Someone had known depth and direction. The small metal rod inserted near the rear wall hadn't been random. They were measuring something. He stood, moved back to the fireplace, pulled the boards up again, this time removing them fully and setting them aside in a straight line against the wall. Atlas rose immediately and stepped closer. Harold lifted the slab once more, exposing the concrete-lined shaft beneath. The air rising from it carried a faint metallic smell, old iron and damp stone. He lowered himself carefully into the cavity, boots finding narrow ledges built into the concrete sides. The space was tight but deliberate, engineered. He shined the flashlight downward. The bottom wasn't flat. There was a secondary recess cut into the far wall, partially concealed by a thin sheet of corrugated metal. That hadn't been visible from above. He leaned lower, extending his arm. The edge of the metal sheet was jagged, broken at one corner. Atlas shifted restlessly above him. "Stay," Harold said quietly. But the dog did not like what he saw. Atlas stepped closer to the opening, peering down, muscles tense. Harold wedged his shoulder against the concrete wall and reached further inside the recess. His fingertips brushed against something behind the metal sheet. Paper. Cloth. Another object concealed deeper. He adjusted his footing. The ledge shifted slightly under his weight. Atlas moved instinctively. Without command, he jumped. The dog dropped into the shaft beside Harold. It happened in a second. Harold's head snapped up. "Atlas!" The dog's front paws hit the lower ledge, then slipped. A sharp metallic tear cut through the confined space. Atlas let out a sudden cry, short, shocked. Harold reacted without thought. He grabbed the dog by the harness strap as Atlas twisted, one rear leg scraping against the jagged metal edge. Blood spotted the concrete instantly. Harold hauled him upward with controlled force, bracing one boot against the wall and lifting until Atlas's weight cleared the ledge. The dog trembled once but did not panic. Harold set him gently onto the cabin floor and climbed out after him. One of the firelight flickered across red, spreading into Atlas's fur near the rear leg. Harold knelt immediately. His hands were steady. He rolled Atlas gently onto his side and examined the wound. A clean slice. Not deep enough to sever muscle, but open. Atlas's breathing was fast, chest rising and falling sharply. Yet he did not pull away. He held eye contact with Harold. Harold reached into the small canvas bag he had kept near the truck. Old field kit, still stocked out of habit. He pressed sterile gauze against the cut, applying firm pressure. "Easy," he murmured. Atlas's ears flattened, but he stayed still. Harold worked quickly, cleaned the wound with measured movements, wrapped it tight but not restricting. His hands remembered what his mind did not need to think about. Field repairs, stop the bleed, stabilize, assess mobility. He finished the wrap and rested one palm lightly against Atlas's neck, feeling the dog's pulse steadying beneath his fingers. "Should have stayed," he said softly. Atlas blinked slowly. Harold sat back on his heels. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the dog beside him. The injury wasn't catastrophic, but it was personal. The metal sheet inside that recess hadn't broken by accident. It had been torn recently. Harold stood again and looked down into the shaft. The jagged edge gleamed faintly under the beam of the flashlight. Someone had tried to reach behind it, and had failed. Harold retrieved a pair of heavy gloves from the truck and climbed back down, alone this time. He removed the broken sheet carefully, bending it away from the recess. But behind it, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a rusted tin, lay several tightly bound notebooks. Not modern, not new. Handwritten labels marked their spines in fading ink. He lifted them one by one and passed them up through the opening. The last object inside the recess was a rolled document tube made of hardened leather. He extracted that as well. When he climbed out, Atlas was sitting upright despite the bandaged leg, watching the opening with narrowed eyes. Harold replaced the slab loosely and set the boards aside for now. He carried the notebooks to the table beside the metal box. The oilcloth smelled faintly of cedar. He unwrapped the first notebook. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, his mother's. The first page wasn't recipes. It wasn't gardening notes. It was a survey, land boundaries, water rights, hut coordinates, measured depths, hand-drawn maps. Harold's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a family cabin. It was documented property with something valuable beneath it. He unrolled the leather tube. Inside was a formal certificate. Water extraction rights. Underground aquifer access registered decades earlier. And a separate document, quietly filed and never mentioned, granting private drilling privileges across several acres. The kind of paperwork most people wouldn't understand the value of. But developers would. Atlas shifted beside him, wincing slightly, but refusing to lie down. Harold reached down and scratched gently behind his ear. "You found it," he said. The dog's tail moved once against the floor. Harold looked toward the door, toward the tree line. Derek Cole hadn't come here to buy a broken cabin, and the men in the dark hadn't come to scare him away. They had come for this. He gathered the notebooks and placed them back inside the oilcloth. Then he turned his attention to the metal box, still sitting unopened on the table. The firelight flickered across its surface. Atlas's breathing slowed, but his eyes remained alert. Harold rested one hand on the lid. Outside, the forest stood silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt patient. Harold didn't open the metal box right away. He moved first to Atlas. The dog had shifted closer to the fire, lowering himself carefully onto his side, keeping the injured leg extended. His eyes followed Harold's every movement, not anxious, just measuring. Harold knelt again and checked the bandage. No fresh bleed. Swelling controlled. He adjusted the wrap slightly, went fingers firm but careful. "You're staying put," he said quietly. Atlas blinked once, steady. Harold rose and walked to the front window. He peeled the curtain back just enough to see the clearing. Morning light filtered through pine branches, long shadows stretching across the dirt. The truck sat where it had been left. No fresh tire tracks from overnight. No movement at the tree line. But the stillness wasn't trust. It was reconnaissance. He let the curtain fall and returned to the table. The metal box was old military surplus. He recognized the style instantly. Reinforced corners. Dual-clasp lid. the kind designed to keep contents dry through transport, not necessarily to keep them hidden. He ran his fingers across the lid. There was no lock, just two heavy clasps. He released the first one slowly. The click sounded louder than it should have. Atlas's ears twitched. Harold paused, listened. Nothing outside. He released the second clasp, lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged in oil-resistant wrapping, were documents, not currency, not jewelry. Paperwork layered in protective sleeves. Beneath them lay a small velvet pouch and a sealed envelope. Harold removed the envelope first. His name wasn't written on it, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Rose Bennett. He held it for a long moment before opening it. The letter inside was short. No long explanations. No sentiment. Harold, if you are reading this, then you came back for more than shelter. The land is not what it appears on paper. What lies beneath it will matter someday. You were trained to build under pressure. You know what to protect, but don't let them measure what they do not understand. Mother. Harold folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the notebooks. He moved to the documents inside the box. Registered drilling surveys. Independent geological assessments. Water quality tests spanning 20 years. A full aquifer report marked with official seals. He scanned the figures. Volume capacity. Recharge rate. Purity levels. It wasn't a small underground spring. It was one of the largest untouched freshwater pockets in the county, and it ran beneath his mother's land. His land now. Harold leaned back slightly in the chair. The pieces aligned. Derek Cole. The probing rod in the foundation. 2 vehicles last night. They hadn't been searching blindly. They knew something was here. They just hadn't found proof yet. When he opened the velvet pouch next, inside was a small key, different from the brass cabin key, engraved with a bank insignia, Swiss. Harold stared at it. He didn't smile. He didn't react outwardly. He simply placed it beside the other documents. Atlas shifted, adjusting his injured leg carefully. Harold stood and moved to him. He crouched and rested one hand against the dog's neck again. "You found the right floor," he murmured. Atlas let out a slow breath and rested his chin lightly against Harold's knee. Harold remained there for a moment longer than necessary. Then he rose and began moving through the cabin with new intent. He closed the slab fully and secured the boards back in place, tight this time. He relocated the documents into a concealed section beneath the old kitchen cabinet rather than leaving them on the table. He disassembled the crude trap mechanism he had disabled earlier and set the parts aside for inspection. Then he stepped outside. The clearing looked unchanged, but Harold's eyes were different now. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots pressing into the dirt near the tree line. He followed the fresh tire tracks from the night before, examining tread depth and direction. 2 vehicles, different weight distribution, one heavier, one lighter. He traced where they had stopped. One set had reversed quickly. The other lingered longer. He crouched near the rear corner of the cabin where the probing rod had been inserted. He measured the angle in his mind. They had aimed for the cavity beneath the fireplace. They hadn't known about the secondary recess. Not yet. Atlas limped slightly as he stepped out onto the porch, ignoring Harold's earlier instruction to stay inside. Harold turned. The dog held steady, even with the injured leg, eyes scanning the clearing. Harold walked back toward him and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Inside," he said more clearly this time. Atlas hesitated, then obeyed. Harold stood alone in the clearing for another minute. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like contested ground. He returned inside and shut the door. He pulled the metal box toward him again and flipped through the remaining pages. The aquifer report listed future projected values if municipal demand increased. Water scarcity maps. Development projections. The value of the land wasn't sentimental. It was strategic. And his mother had known. She had prepared for this. Harold folded the maps carefully and placed them back inside the oilcloth. He tucked the Swiss key into his inside jacket pocket. Then he sat back in the chair and stared into the fire. Atlas shifted again, laying his head against the floor near Harold's boots. Harold's gaze unfocused for a second. Not drifting, calculating. The men last night weren't amateurs. The trap at the door had been designed to intimidate, not destroy. A warning. Derek Cole hadn't come here alone in interest. He had come to confirm occupancy. The aquifer was the objective, and now Harold understood the scale. This wasn't about buying a rundown cabin. It was about control. He leaned forward and added another log to the fire. The flames rose higher. Shadows danced along the walls. Then he reached for one of the notebooks and opened it again. This time he flipped past the surveys, past the water rights, toward the back. The final pages contained something different. Handwritten notes in his mother's steady script. Names, small-town officials, land registries. Dates of attempts to acquire adjacent property. Notes about outside investors. Harold's jaw tightened again. This had been building long before he arrived. He closed the notebook. Atlas lifted his head slightly, as if sensing the shift. Harold leaned down and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. "We're not leaving," he said quietly. Outside, a distant engine echoed faintly from beyond the ridge. Not close enough to see. Not close enough to act. But close enough to remind him. They would come back. And next time, they would not be testing. They didn't wait long. 2 days later, just after noon, Harold heard the engine again. Not cautious this time. Not creeping through the trees in the dark. The black pickup rolled into the clearing in full daylight, dust rising behind it like a signal flare. Harold was outside, repairing the porch rail with salvaged wood and a box of old screws he'd found in the shed. Atlas lay nearby in the shade, bandaged legs stretched forward, but healing well enough for him to shift his weight without flinching. The truck stopped closer than before. Derek Cole stepped out without sunglasses this time. No pretense of surprise. No casual smile. He walked straight toward the cabin, boots crunching over gravel. Atlas rose slowly. He did not bark. He moved in front of Harold and stood there, shoulders squared, weight distributed carefully despite the injury. Derek noticed the bandage. "Looks like he had a rough night," Derek said. Harold set the screwdriver down, but did not descend the porch steps. "He'll heal." Derek studied the porch, then the tree line, then the foundation of the cabin. His eyes lingered just slightly too long near the back corner. "You've been busy," Derek said. "Digging around." Harold didn't answer. The silence stretched. Derek shifted his stance. "I think it's time we stop pretending this is about nostalgia," he said finally. "You know what's under this land." Harold's face did not change. "Do I?" Derek took one step closer. "The aquifer," he said plainly. "It runs beneath this entire ridge. Clean, untapped. The county's been mapping it for years." Atlas's ears flattened slightly. Derek continued. "You're sitting on something that's worth more than that old house ever was." Harold tilted his head just slightly. "And you're sitting on paperwork that's not finished," he said calmly. Derek's jaw tightened. "That paperwork will be finished," he replied. "One way or another." The wind moved through the trees behind him, carrying the faint scent of pine and dry earth. Harold stepped down from the porch now, not aggressively, but deliberately. He positioned himself beside Atlas rather than behind him. "How long have you been watching this place?" Harold asked. Derek hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Long enough," he said. "How long have you been measuring it?" Derek's eyes flicked briefly toward the back of the cabin. "You think you're the only one who knows how to assess terrain?" Derek said quietly, as Harold held his gaze. "Your men were sloppy." That struck. Derek's expression hardened. "They weren't my men." Harold didn't blink. "2 vehicles," he said. "Different tread patterns, different weight distribution. One trying to dig, one trying to scare them off." Derek exhaled sharply. "You don't understand the scale of what this is," he said. "Investors from Boise, from out of state. They've already acquired adjacent parcels. This ridge is the last piece." Atlas shifted forward half a step, teeth barely visible now. Derek glanced down at the dog. "Keep him under control." He is under control, Harold replied evenly. The air between them felt thinner now. Derek's voice dropped lower. You don't have the equipment to drill. You don't have the capital to extract. Oh, and you don't have the protection to hold this land when the pressure starts. Harold's face remained unreadable. I don't need to drill it, he said. Derek frowned. Then what do you need? Harold let the question hang. The silence forced Derek to fill it. You think you can just sit up here and guard it? Derek pressed. You're 72 years old. Atlas's tail twitched once. Harold's shoulders remained steady. You're standing on my mother's land, he said quietly. Talking about pressure. Derek looked around the clearing again, frustration creeping into his posture. This isn't personal, he said. It is to me. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice further. There are people who won't come out in daylight like I did, he said. People who don't ask. Harold didn't flinch. I've met people like that. The words carried weight, not threat. Experience. Derek held his gaze for several long seconds. Then he straightened. All right, he said finally. Let's speak plainly. He reached into his truck and retrieved a manila envelope. He walked back toward Harold and held it out. Initial offer, he said. 7 figures. Clean transfer. Immediate. Harold didn't reach for it. Atlas's growl deepened, low and steady. Derek placed the envelope on the porch step instead. You can't hold this forever, he said. Harold looked down at the envelope, then back at Derek. I don't need forever. Derek's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means, Harold said slowly, you don't know what my mother left behind. That unsettled him. Derek stepped back toward his truck. This is bigger than you, he said, and bigger than me. Harold nodded once. Then you'd better decide who you're working for. Derek paused at the driver's door. You think you can protect it? He asked. Atlas shifted forward again, despite the injured leg, placing himself fully between Harold and the truck. Derek looked at the dog one more time. Then he got in. The engine roared louder this time. The truck reversed sharply and tore down the trail without subtlety. Dust hung in the air long after the vehicle disappeared. Harold stood still until the clearing settled again. Atlas turned his head slowly toward him, eyes searching. Harold reached down and rested his hand against the dog's neck. They're not the only ones, he said quietly. He picked up the envelope from the porch. He didn't open it. When he carried it inside and set it beside the fire. The amount didn't matter. The offer proved one thing. The land had been marked, and the next move would not come in daylight. Harold didn't sleep that night. He lay fully dressed on the narrow cot beside the wood stove, boots placed within reach, jacket folded under his head. The fire had burned low, just enough glow to shape the room in soft amber edges. Atlas rested near the door, chin on his paws, eyes half closed, but never fully gone. Outside, the forest settled into its night rhythm, branches shifting, small animals moving through brush, wind pressing against the cabin walls. To someone else, it might have sounded peaceful. To Harold, it was layered. He separated each sound the way he once separated radio chatter, background noise from signal. At 1:17 a.m., something changed. A soft metallic vibration. Brief. Faint. Not wind. Atlas lifted his head immediately. No bark. Just stillness. Harold didn't move for several seconds. He counted his breaths. Let his hearing sharpen further. There. A second faint sound. Metal against metal. Low to the ground. Harold slid off the cot silently and moved toward the rear window. He stayed below the frame and eased the curtain back a fraction. Nothing obvious. No headlights. No figures. But the tree line felt wrong. Atlas was already up, weight forward, shoulders tight. Harold reached for the small flashlight near the table but didn't switch it on. Instead, he moved toward the back door and waited. The sound came again. Closer now, a faint scrape near the foundation. Harold stepped out suddenly, lights snapping on in the same motion. Yet the beam cut across the back of the cabin. And there it was. A thin steel cable stretched low between two trees near the rear corner, almost invisible in the dark. Anchored toward the cabin wall. A crude trip line. Not meant to kill. Meant to disable. Meant to create panic. Atlas lunged forward, growl erupting from his chest. Harold grabbed his collar immediately. "Hold," he whispered. Atlas froze, trembling with restrained energy. Harold traced the cable carefully with the flashlight beam. It ran toward a small device concealed behind brush. A flashbang deterrent. Non-lethal, but loud enough to disorient. Harold crouched and disarmed it slowly. Whoever set it had assumed he would stumble in the dark. They didn't know him. He clipped the cable and removed the device, carrying it back inside. Atlas limped beside him, while refusing to fall behind. Harold placed the device on the table and studied it under the lamp. Professional, not homemade. Someone with access to equipment. He walked back to the door and scanned the clearing once more. Nothing visible, but he knew. They had been watching. Testing again. He shut the door and reinforced the lock with a steel bar he had installed that afternoon. The cabin no longer felt fragile. It felt fortified. Morning came gray and cold. Harold worked without speaking. He reinforced the fence line with salvaged posts, digging each hole deep and packing earth tight around the base. Atlas moved slowly along the perimeter, nose close to the ground, tracking scents. He paused near the tree line and stared into the forest for a long time. Harold noticed. He walked over and crouched beside him. So the ground there showed faint impressions. Boot prints, fresh. They hadn't left after setting the cable. They had stayed long enough to observe. Harold studied the direction of the tracks. North Ridge. He memorized it. Then he straightened. By midday, the cabin looked different. Subtle changes. Window shutters reinforced from inside. Motion-triggered lights repositioned to eliminate blind spots. The back entrance cleared of brush. Not militarized, but deliberate. Holding the line. Atlas lay near the porch steps again, panting lightly as the sun warmed the clearing. Harold brought him fresh water and checked the wound. Healing clean. No infection. "You're not done yet," Harold murmured. Atlas blinked and rested his chin against Harold's hand. Late afternoon brought another sound. This time not hidden. And a car engine climbing the trail. Harold stood immediately. Atlas rose too. The vehicle that emerged was not Derek's truck. It was a silver SUV, clean, polished. It stopped several yards from the porch. The driver's door opened slowly. Linda Bennett stepped out. Harold didn't move. Atlas did not bark. Linda wore city clothes that looked out of place against the dirt and pine needles. She removed her sunglasses and looked at the cabin as if assessing damage. "So this is where you ran," she said. Harold remained still. "I didn't run." She glanced around the clearing, taking in the reinforced fence, the new boards, the cleared brush. "You've been busy." Harold stepped off the porch and stood several feet away from her. Atlas positioned himself at his side. "I heard about the offer," Linda said. "Oh, Derek came to see me." Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not part of this land," he said. "I was married to you," she replied sharply. "That makes me part of anything you acquire within certain time frames." Her tone had changed from personal to legal. She stepped closer. "There are joint claims that can still be pursued," she said. "You don't have the resources to fight that." Atlas shifted forward, posture tightening. Linda glanced at him. "Control your dog," she said. "He's controlled," Harold replied. She lowered her voice. "You don't know who you're up against," she said. "This isn't about pride." Harold looked past her at the SUV. No visible passengers, but tinted windows. "You came alone?" he asked. Linda hesitated. "For now." The air felt heavier again. She stepped closer. "Sell," she said. Take the money. Move somewhere quiet." Harold held her gaze. "This is quiet." Linda's expression flickered. Impatience. Calculation. You always did prefer dirt to people, she said. Harold didn't respond. She exhaled sharply. Fine, she said, but don't expect sympathy when this turns ugly. She walked back toward the SUV. Atlas did not take his eyes off her. Before getting in, Linda turned once more. You think this land gives you something back? She said. Harold didn't answer. She shook her head and got into the vehicle. The SUV reversed slowly and disappeared down the trail. Silence returned. Harold remained standing for a long time after the engine noise faded. Atlas leaned lightly against his leg. The pressure wasn't heavy, just present. Harold exhaled slowly. Two fronts now. External pressure. Legal pressure. He walked back to the cabin and shut the door. He looked at the aquifer maps once more, then at the Swiss key in his pocket. This wasn't just about holding ground anymore. It was about proving ownership. Atlas lay down near the door again, head upright, eyes scanning the window. Harold placed the disarmed device on the shelf beside the stove. A reminder. They would escalate. So would he. The papers arrived 3 days later. Certified mail, official stamps, county seal. Harold stood at the edge of the dirt road as the rural carrier handed him the envelope without stepping fully out of the truck. The man gave a polite nod, but didn't linger. News traveled fast in mountain towns. So did speculation. Atlas remained pressed against Harold's leg, watching the truck roll away. Yet Harold didn't open the envelope until he was back inside the cabin. He placed it on the table beside the aquifer maps and the Swiss key. Then he sat down slowly. His hands didn't shake. They never did. He slit the envelope open with his old pocket knife. Legal language filled the first page. Claims of shared marital assets. Emergency petition for temporary injunction regarding transfer or development of newly discovered land value. A hearing date scheduled in Boise. Linda's name at the top. Her attorney beneath it. Harold read every word without expression. Atlas shifted near the door, sensing the change in atmosphere. Harold folded the papers once and set them down. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, wind brushed lightly against the trees, carrying the scent of snow further up the ridge. Winter wasn't far, while he stood and moved to the window. The clearing looked the same, but it wasn't. Pressure no longer approached only through dark trails and hidden cables. Now it came stamped and filed. He turned back toward the table and picked up his mother's notebook again. The final pages listed more than land surveys. There were legal notes, water rights filings, independent conservation registrations. She had anticipated acquisition attempts, and she had layered protection. Harold traced one line with his finger. Trust designation. Sole heir conditional. He leaned back slowly. Atlas rose and walked toward him, placing his head lightly against Harold's thigh. Harold rested his hand on the dog's neck. She planned farther ahead than they think, he murmured. Atlas's breathing remained steady, and Harold rose and moved toward the small cabinet where he had hidden the documents earlier. He retrieved the full folder and spread the papers across the table. The aquifer rights were not attached to the marital estate. They were tied to a trust filed years before his marriage, registered solely in Rose Bennett's name, transferred to Harold after her passing. Linda's claim could touch the cabin, but not the water. He exhaled once. Not relief. Clarity. That afternoon, a second vehicle approached the clearing. Not Derek's truck, not Linda's SUV, a white sedan with out-of-state plates. It stopped near the edge of the property. A man in a tailored coat stepped out. Lawyer. Harold didn't need introduction. The man walked forward with careful posture, shoes unsuited for dirt and pine needles. Mr. Bennett? He called out politely. Harold stepped off the porch. Atlas followed. The lawyer offered a thin smile. I represent your wife in this matter. Former wife, Harold corrected. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Of course. He held up a folder. We would prefer to resolve this amicably. Harold remained silent. The lawyer continued. There are substantial development interests tied to this ridge. Litigation will not be pleasant. nor inexpensive. Atlas stood between them now, not growling, but fixed. The lawyer glanced down briefly. "Is he safe?" he asked. "He is," Harold replied. The man cleared his throat. "My client believes you are acting emotionally, that you may not fully grasp the financial implications." Harold's gaze remained level. "I understand implications," he said quietly. The lawyer hesitated. "Oh, there are buyers prepared to move quickly," he said. "Offers that may not remain on the table." Harold studied him. "How many parcels have already changed hands?" he asked. The lawyer paused. "I'm not at liberty to discuss broader transactions." "Then you're not here for my benefit." The lawyer's polite smile thinned. "We are offering you a way out," he said. Harold stepped closer, just enough to close the distance by a few feet. "I didn't ask for one." The lawyer's composure tightened. "You may find yourself overwhelmed." Harold's eyes did not leave his. "I've been overwhelmed before." Silence settled between them. Wind stirred again through the trees. The lawyer finally exhaled and lowered the folder slightly. "Very well," he said. "Oh, you'll receive formal notice regarding the hearing." He turned and walked back toward his car. Atlas watched him the entire time. Only when the sedan disappeared did Harold shift his stance. He walked back into the cabin and closed the door firmly. The room felt smaller now, tighter. He sat at the table again and looked at the Swiss key. He hadn't acted on it yet, hadn't contacted anyone. But now he understood something else. His mother hadn't just left protection. She had left leverage. Atlas limped toward him and settled near the stove, eyes half closed but alert. Harold reached for the phone on the counter. The signal here was weak, intermittent. But enough. He stepped outside and climbed the short rise behind the cabin where reception was stronger. Atlas followed despite the incline. Harold dialed a number written inside the notebook. An international code. A quiet, distant voice answered. Harold spoke briefly. Gave identification. Spoke his mother's name. There was a pause on the line. Then confirmation. The account existed. Protected. Unclaimed since Rose Bennett's passing. Harold ended the call. He stood there for a moment, staring across the valley below. Lights flickered faintly in distant towns. Atlas leaned against his leg again. Harold crouched and rested both hands on the dog's shoulders. They tried to take everything, he said softly. Atlas held his gaze. But they didn't know what was already buried. Wind moved through the ridge again. Not threatening this time, just present. Harold rose slowly. The legal fight would come. So would the next move from Derek. But now he knew something they did not. The land was not his only defense, and whatever they believed they had cornered, they hadn't measured the whole ground. The hearing in Boise lasted less than 40 minutes. Harold wore the same jacket he had worn in Afghanistan winters, cleaned, pressed, but unmistakably old. Atlas waited in the truck outside the courthouse, windows cracked slightly, head visible between the seats, eyes tracking every passerby. Inside, the room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Linda sat on the opposite side of the table with her attorney. Derek Cole occupied a seat further back, arms folded, watching. Harold stood when instructed. He spoke only when addressed. The judge flipped through documents, pausing at the trust filings Rose Bennett had established years before Harold's marriage, when water rights registered independently. Transfer documents recorded well before divorce proceedings. Linda's attorney shifted uncomfortably. The aquifer, what Derek and his investors wanted, had never been marital property. Linda's claim narrowed to the cabin structure itself, a structure assessed at minimal value compared to the surrounding land. The judge leaned back slightly. "Mrs. Bennett," he said calmly, "you have no legal claim to the water rights or subsurface assets. The trust is clear." Linda's jaw tightened. Her attorney whispered something to her, low and quick. Derek's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened around the folder in his lap. The judge continued. "If you wish to pursue division of the cabin structure, that is a separate matter. But the principal value you're referencing does not apply." Silence settled over the room. Harold did not look at Linda. He did not look at Derek. He kept his gaze forward. When the judge dismissed them, Linda stood abruptly. "This isn't over," she said quietly, as Harold passed her. Harold stopped. He turned to face her fully. "You took what had my name on it," he said evenly, "but you left what I could build." Linda didn't answer. Derek stepped forward as the hallway emptied. "You think this changes the pressure?" he asked. Harold studied him for a long moment. "You're measuring from the wrong side," he replied. Derek's jaw flexed. "You can't extract that water alone," he said. "I don't need to," Harold answered. He walked past him without further comment. Outside, Atlas lifted his head the second Harold opened the truck door. The dog studied his face for several seconds. Harold reached in and placed his hand against Atlas's neck. "It's ours," he said quietly. Atlas leaned forward, pressing his weight against him. The drive back to the ridge was slow. Clouds hung low over the mountains, snow threatening but not yet falling. When Harold turned onto the dirt trail, the clearing appeared just as it had before, quiet, patient, unchanged. But something had shifted. He parked the truck and stepped out. Atlas followed, limping only slightly now, the injury almost healed. Harold stood in the center of the clearing and took it in. The repaired fence, the reinforced porch, the cleared tree line, the ridge beyond. He walked toward the cabin slowly. No vehicles in sight, no observers in the shadows. Derek's presence had receded. For now. Harold stepped onto the porch and rested his palm against the wooden frame. Inside, the fire pit remained stacked with cut logs. The maps rested on the table. The Swiss key remained in his pocket. He moved to the window and looked out over the slope where the aquifer ran deep beneath the soil. He did not see dollar signs. He saw independence. He saw time. Atlas lay down near the doorway, positioning himself as he always did, between Harold and whatever might approach. Harold crouched beside him. "You kept watch," he murmured. Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor. Harold rose and pulled out his mother's notebook. He opened to a blank page and began writing. Not numbers, plans, seasonal well maintenance, sustainable extraction limits, a partnership with local farmers rather than outside investors. He would not sell the water. He would protect it, use it carefully, on his terms. Late afternoon light filtered through the window, catching dust in the air. Harold stood and walked outside one more time. The forest felt different now. Not hostile, not contested. Just land. Wind moved gently through the pine trees. Atlas joined him, standing close, shoulder brushing against Harold's leg. No engines echoed from the ridge. No legal notices arrived. No shadows lingered between the trees. The pressure had eased, not vanished, but redirected. Harold looked down at Atlas. "You ready?" he asked. Atlas lifted his head, eyes steady. Harold nodded once. They walked the perimeter together. Not in fear, not in defense, but in ownership. The ground beneath their boots held water, memory, and something steadier than money. It held continuity. When dusk settled, Harold secured the door, but left the porch light on, not as a warning, as a statement. Inside, Atlas curled near the stove, finally sleeping deeply for the first time in days. Harold sat at the table, hands resting on the notebook. Outside, the mountains remained quiet. No one came back, and nothing more was taken. "Do you want me to continue?" And nothing more was taken. If you believe some things in life are worth standing your ground for, type 1 in the comments. If you think Harold should have sold and walked away, type 0. I read every single comment, and I'd really like to know where you stand. And if this story meant something to you, if Atlas reminded you of a dog you once had, or Harold reminded you of someone you love, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this coming. Stories about loyalty, about second chances, about people who refuse to fold when the pressure closes in. Stay with us. Do you want me to continue?